Good morning. My name is Tyler McCann. I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin today's webinar, I want to acknowledge that I'm participating in the webinar from Western Quebec, located on the traditional, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. As an organization, CAPI recognizes that there are many steps on the road to reconciliation and that this is a journey that we must all take together, and we continue to reflect on what we can do to play our part. Canadian agriculture and food faces big challenges with the potential for very different solutions that lead to very different outcomes for the sector. Dialogue and debate is essential to getting to better policy outcomes. Instead of shying away from thoughtful debate, we think that we should embrace it. To advance CAPI's mission of advancing policy solutions, the Ag Policy Exchange webinar series offers a platform for respectful debate and dialogue to explore diverse perspectives on critical policy issues. In this webinar, panelists come together to offer their viewpoint on a critical challenge before moving into a more in-depth dialogue. Today's Ag Policy Exchange question is, can Canada hold its own in trade negotiations? It's been a busy time at CAPI. This week, we released our inaugural Agri-Food Risk Report, shining a light on the need to move from optimism to realism. Most of the work was done in 2024, but it highlights some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities and solutions in front of the sector. 2 weeks ago, we released an ag policy brief outlining short, medium, and long-term actions to help the sector survive and thrive in an uncertain relationship with the United States. All of CAPI's work, including the risk report, which was made possible in part by the Global Institute for Food Security, and the policy brief and this webinar, which is made possible in part by the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership, is really made possible because of the support by partners like them and by you. If you want to support the work that CAPI does, please reach out to hear more. As we all know, Canada is facing an uncertain trade future with significant implications for Canadian agriculture. With political uncertainty at home, rising anti-Canadian rhetoric and CUSMA renegotiations threats from the US, challenging Indo-Pacific trade dynamics, the once solid cornerstone of Canadian trade and agriculture seems increasingly unstable. While much of the focus has been on the US threat recently, and we have seen some positive outcomes with trade negotiations in Ecuador and Indonesia, we've also struggled to advance trade negotiations with India, the United Kingdom, and more. So we asked today's question, can Canada hold its own? But before we hear from our panelists, we'd like to hear from you. Please take the opportunity to answer the poll on the screen and let us know your thoughts. Do you think Canada can handle its own in trade negotiations? Yes, no, not anymore, or yes, but not with the United States. Please take the opportunity to answer this question. We'll come back to it at the end to see if anyone has changed their mind. During the webinar, you can also take the opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A function. You'll be able to also add support for other questions that have been asked by others, so we can see what really motivates you, the CAPI audience. We hope to make this as engaging as and interactive as possible. As was noted in the chat, interpretation is also available through the closed caption function if you select closed captions on the bottom of your screen. So the result of the poll, 60% of you think Canada can handle its own. 6% think it can't, 7% say not anymore, and 28, almost 3 out of 10 say yes, but not with the US. Thank you for your participation. And now let's hear from the panel. I'd like to first bring in our first panelist, Claire Citeau. She's a Vice President and DC Envoy with the Canadian Meat Council. As former Executive Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, Claire has worked on numerous bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements, including CETA, CPTPP, CUSMA, the UK CTA, and the WTO. Claire is also a Senior Research Fellow with CAPI. Claire, what do you think? Can Canada handle its own in trade agreements?
Thank you for having me. So the question of whether Canada can hold its own trade agreements is particularly important at this time, as you said, and for Canada's economic future. We have 15 free trade agreements covering about 70% of our economy, giving us access to 1.5 billion customers around the world. So this proves our ability to negotiate agreements, but merely having free trade agreements in place is not enough. I think the real test lies in utilizing them effectively and, importantly, adapting to rapidly changing global conditions. Let's be clear, we have excellent trade negotiators who can deliver a comprehensive agreement that go beyond tariffs, that can address modern challenges like labor, the environment, intellectual property. They are also experienced in working within the WTO framework, keeping global borders open to agri-food when the world was on lockdown during COVID, and pushing back on trade restrictions and renegotiating NAFTA. Canada has also been showing leadership globally. We formed the Ottawa Group. We've delivered an interim WTO dispute settlement mechanism in the absence of an appellate body. And I will say our free trade agreements consistently focus on preventing and resolving issues through various cooperation mechanism and robust SPS mechanisms in particular. So the challenge is really isn't making deals, it's maximizing their impact. Three challenges ahead of us. As I briefly mentioned, I think we are underutilizing our trade agreements. The CETA, or free trade agreement with Europe, is one example. It should be yielding greater benefits, in particular for small and medium-sized businesses. It's a large, high-value market of 400 million people, where our competitors are doing relatively well, and they don't have a free trade agreement. So, yes, recognizing that the EU is a complex market of markets, with many member states that have yet to ratify the deal, and that in large part, our businesses are also focused with their eyes set on Asia, where growth is coming from. That being said, I think it is a missed opportunity here that we should look at. The global trading environment is a second challenge, obviously, and you've mentioned it, increasingly volatile. We've seen growing trends toward protectionist policies in the US, Mexico, and elsewhere as well. And we know that certainly it creates an uncertainty, and the real worry right now is the unraveling. And I will add a third challenge is internally at home. We must address domestic barriers and regulatory red tape that limit our own competitiveness. We have opportunities to perhaps modernize our own regulations, expedite processes, ensuring that CFIA, Ag Canada, AFC have the resources to do so. The path forward, beyond addressing internal issues, I think needs to look aggressively at diversifying our trade relationships through free trade agreements, but with the caveat that first, I think we need to be we should not be complacent in explaining the benefits of trade liberalization. And second, we need to recognize that free trade agreements discussions continue to take place even if the agreement is signed and ratified. The value, importantly, of a free trade agreement is in large part bringing parties back to the negotiating table and engaging our trading partners through committees, councils, or some other form of cooperation mechanisms. So I wrote down three, I think there are more, but I wrote down three main recommendations on the path forward. First, I think we need to prioritize implementation of free trade agreements, and this includes the timely ratification and effective implementation of trade agreements. This is critical. Delays will simply result in lost market share. When we look at some of the agreements that Canada has recently concluded, we need to ratify the Indonesia and Ecuador FTAs quickly, but also in parallel, move to get the certifications and food safety checks in place. As we know, agriculture is highly regulated, and we need the tariffs removed, but also the sanitary and phytosanitary approvals too. And this is vitally important because if a tariff can slow trade, not meeting a standard is an absolute barrier to trade. The second point on the path forward is to drive diversification. We need to actively, aggressively pursue trade opportunities beyond our traditional partners, particularly I mentioned in Europe, but also importantly in the Indo-Pacific region. And there's been ramblings in the media in recent days about reviving the UK FTA. Overall, I think we need to support Canadian businesses in fast-growing emerging markets and help companies take full advantage of free trade agreements through trade missions, boots on the ground. I think we need to look at the Ag Office in the Indo-Pacific region, or also the Canadian Red Meat Office that we are opening in China. Through boots on the ground and strong industry and government collaboration, I think we're better prepared to target key markets proactively, but also build the relationships that we need. And that is actually my third point, to foster strong industry and government relations, to make sure that we are all moving towards the same outcome, but we also are better prepared and respond to market changes and demands. If we can advocate with one voice at home, but also importantly abroad, it can only strengthen our influence. So to the question, can Canada hold its own trade agreement? I think the focus is really on our implementation and improving our competitiveness and diversifying trade relationships, and doing so in a way that sees industry and government work in tandem. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We do have initiatives that have demonstrated success. We just need to put the wheels on the cart and push the pedal.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for starting us off. We'll next bring in our second panelist, Colin Robertson. As a former Canadian diplomat, Colin is now the Senior Advisor and Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and host of its regular Global Exchange podcast. Colin, I was pleased to be a guest on yours, and I'm happy now to have you join us. He has held key diplomatic roles, contributed to major trade agreements, and serves on multiple advisory councils while writing on foreign affairs for the Globe and Mail and other media outlets. Colin, when you look around the world today, can Canada hold its own in trade negotiations?
Tyler, yes, delighted to be with you. And Canada can hold its own, but we can hold our own when the playing field is level, and it's not level anymore. Our biggest partner, the United States, has gone rogue, and that is creating big problems for us, because that is, of course, 75% of our exports and 60% of our imports. And they are most important, not only just our trading relationship, but they also provide us with our security blanket, defense blanket, and we manage the continent, because you can't change geography, our resources, environment, and things together. So that's a big problem for us. So what do we do? Well, I think I would agree with everything Claire has said in terms of trade diversification, the fact that we can compete, the fact that we have all these agreements. The underutilization of these agreements has been remarked on consistently in the annual states of trade that Global Affairs puts out. But I don't fault the negotiators for that. Remember, negotiators at the federal government, they open the doors, and then it's up to business, supported, I think, largely by the provinces, because I think the level of government that's closest to the reality of trade is the provincial level. And I think what we need to see more of, and we've seen this, and I think the threat from the US is acting as a bit of a catalytic experience for the premiers. The fact that premiers are all down in Washington last week, and some of them are going back again to see their national governor counterparts. That's exactly what we've got to be doing. We've got to be getting out there, making the Canadian case. And I think, as I say, I know there's a big trade delegation going off to Australia led by our trade minister right now, but I would rather see provincial trade ministers leading provincial trade delegations out and making the case for their own, because they can do it better, and you can focus much more on the meat and potatoes, or cars and trucks, or computers, whatever it is we're trying to sell. Services, services we're actually quite good at. I think that's the challenge. I also think that, yes, there's the threat of tariffs, and we'll just have to suffer through that, but it should act as a stimulus for us to get our own house in order. 10 years ago, we were we were competing with the United States in terms of, as the US productivity grew, our productivity grew at the same rate. And then it sort of fell off. And I've asked why. Economists tell me it's partly a combination of COVID, partly a combination of government policies. I think, as Mark Carney puts it now, the current government is focused less on growth than on social justice. But really, to have social justice, you got to have growth. And so I think that no matter who forms the next government, I think there'll be probably more emphasis on that, if only because of the stimulus that the United States is providing us to get, as I say, our own house in order. And that means taking on internal trade barriers, which have been, this is the unfinished business of Confederation. It's estimated this costs us about 3 to 4% in GDP, something we can deal with. And I think the premiers are probably the best poised to do that. I think that, again, Mr. Trump has encouraged us to take a hard look at this. And I think that the federal government exercising its convening powers, we saw with the Prime Minister a week and a half ago in Toronto, but the real drive for this has to come province by province, reducing the barriers on things like procurement, on how you manage credentialing for truck drivers, for example, or plumbers and electricians. Western Canada has made progress on this with the New West Partnership, but that also has flagged in recent years, largely as a result, I think, of incompatible personalities amongst premiers in the West. But I hope that picks up, and if we used, for example, just the New West Partnership as the kind of baseline as to where we should be going to, and other provinces came onto that, that would take us forward. And obviously, we've got resources. I think that these are the crown jewels of Canada. I think we've foolishly turned a blind eye to them, and I think we probably should be building, first of all, an electrical grid, probably pipelines to either coast, if we can get business interested. And then we're going to have to be some, government's quite happy to put money into EV batteries. I think that's great. I think renewable resources are the wave of the future for us, especially if we deal with global warming and climate change. But we still have, in the meantime, to get there. And we are extremely well endowed with oil and gas, uranium, potash, other things that the world wants. We have the potential. I think we really are an agri-food power. We have the potential to be an energy superpower if we can get alternate markets. And that is, again, a made in Canada solution if we can harness our resources and get them to salt water and then onto other markets. This is all doable, but it will require a major attitudinal change on the part of both governments at the federal, provincial, and I think local level, and a sort of sense that, okay, we're doing this so that we can get to where we want to be, but in the meantime, let's use what we've got. And because we are going to face, I think, a threat from the United States ongoing. I don't think that Mr. Trump going in 4 years is going to change things. We saw under Mr. Biden, he kept tariffs and things in place. We face American protectionism. Mr. Biden embraced industrial policy. We have as well. I think that's the wave of the future. So to conclude, I would say yes, that first, certainly we can compete. And yes, we've got to make better use of our trade agreements. And yes, we've got to diversify trade. But first of all, we've got to get our own house in order. And that starts with the barriers between provinces, and also coming up with an industrial strategy that for Canadians that is driven by the provinces with the full partnership of the federal government. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Colin. A couple of things that we can pick up in the chat thereafter. Our next panelist is John Maswald. John has had an extensive career in government relations and trade, including serving as the agriculture counselor for the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and as Director of Government and International Affairs at the Canadian Cattle Association. John continues to serve as the Director Emeritus of the International Relations at CCA and as Vice President of the International Meat Secretariat. John, your turn to tell us whether or not you think Canada can hold its own in trade negotiations.
Great, thanks, Tyler, and really appreciate you putting this on and inviting me to participate. I think, when we were first seeing the question, I think some of us were interpreting is to have something to do with the capability of the negotiators we have, and I think there's a lot more moving parts in the question. I would certainly say as a point of departure that, yeah, our negotiators are very capable. I don't think that's anything we need to be concerned about, but I think keep in mind that it's the negotiators don't set the objectives, and they certainly don't make the final decisions. It's the elected leaders that do that. So I think, if you kind of break it into pieces in a negotiation, it's the negotiators, they do the analysis, they identify the barriers, explore the potential, they make the recommendations, and based on that work, then the elected leaders determine what objectives Canada is going to take into the negotiation, and they instruct the negotiators what they may or may not discuss. Now it's getting a little bit into the nuts and bolts and the weeds, but as kind of being outside the government, as someone that's trying to get its objectives for Canadian beef producers, it's important to understand the process that you go through, and leading up to a negotiation, that there is that analysis that's taking place. So, certainly if you feel that Canada may or may not be able to hold its own, you certainly need to participate in the process and explain to negotiators what it is that you need for your sector to define success, and that they can get that in there. I think unfortunately there's too many Canadians who fear trade negotiations. They feel that giving up anything to gain access is too big a price to pay, and I think that's been a big factor. Particularly you go back in the 80s, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Everyone was afraid of it. Maybe it's lessened so, but I think there is that fear, and that fear holds the political leaders back somewhat, in terms of setting the negotiating objectives, and in turn then puts constraints on what our trade negotiators are authorized to talk about, or what they're authorized to achieve. So all through the negotiations, those negotiators, they report back to the elected officials regularly, until it inevitably reaches a point where leaders have to make a decision whether the deal is good enough. And more often than not, it's probably not going to achieve everything that every Canadian exporter wanted to gain. It's probably going to change some things that some Canadians didn't want to change. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a balance of what's deemed best for Canada overall. Not everyone across the country is going to agree on that, but a decision will be made whether it's a deal that we want to go forward with or not. I would say mostly we've gotten it right. We've had good deals for the most part. And, that kind of leads us now to the gorilla in the room, which is our agreement with the US. It has been excellent for Canada. It hasn't been perfect. It's evolved. It's been improved many times, and in many ways over the years. We're all aware of the high profile renegotiations and rebranding, or just rebranding. But, below the radar, there's an awful lot of working groups and interpretations and kind of contacts back and forth, to make it continuously evolving. So with that background, though, I mean, there's no denying we're heading into new territory. What's written on the agreement has not been honored by, not being honored by the person who signed that agreement, the person who said it was the best agreement ever. So, where does that leave us? I think the first step is we have to figure out what the objectives will be. And we really don't know that yet. We really don't know what the US wants to achieve. It seems to change frequently. We've heard some things that are flat out non-starters. And we also don't know what Canada's objective will be. We think we know, but we're not there yet. I'm sure that the trade officials in the departments, the various departments, are doing their best to analyze what the Americans want as well as what we want. So there is that opportunity that if you've got something you need, now's the time to make that opinion known. There will be things that we can agree to because they make sense for us in their own right, things that we should be doing anyway. There's going to be things that we can do for the right price. And then again, there's going to be some very difficult things and some non-starters. But we have to get through the current situation that we're in right now. I mean, we're in limbo right now. Neither side has its team in place. We all know that Washington doesn't have its cabinet and other political appointments in place yet. And, we all know that we're going to change prime ministers and cabinet ministers at least once, and maybe good chance of maybe twice this year. So, they always tell you not to speculate these things, but my crystal ball tells me that the scope of the decisions that we're going to have to make here in Canada are going to be beyond what a current lame duck prime minister can impose on a successor. Or, once we're into an election writ period, it's going to be beyond what is possible under the caretaker provision. So we need time. But that's not to say there's not things that can be done right now. So right now, we have to keep the lines of communication open with the US. All these efforts to get to Washington and talk to Americans are really valuable. We have to learn as much as we can about what their objectives might be. We have to help them understand why trade with us is good for them. We can't go to the States and say, oh, Canada, we need this. We have to talk about what's in it for them. And we have to really try to delay any further deterioration until we can get our own machinery of government, our decision-making structure in place, so that we can pursue, find whatever kind of process is going to work for the longer-term outcome. But I think we have to be real with ourselves. There's nothing easy left. We've done the, whatever analogy you want to use or cliche, the low-hanging fruit, that's all been done. Everything that's not already agreed to, it's going to be somebody's sensitivity. So we got to ask ourselves, who pays to protect that sensitivity? Both sides do. There's Canadians that when the deal is done, they're left wondering, well, why didn't we get the access we expected? And on the other side, that remaining barrier lingers. It lingers like a festering wound that eventually has to be dealt with. I can tell you from Canadian beef exporters' perspective, we know that the EU has multiple layers of non-tariff barriers that have lingered unaddressed, and it's something that we still are trying to address. In the meantime, it's undermining the potential of the CETA. So perhaps we'll find out if our current difficulties with the US can become a catalyst for real opportunity for Canadian red meat exports to the EU. And every sector has probably got something out there that they need to say, well, in this situation, maybe we can do something else, whether it's domestically, whether it's around the world. We've got some ideas about speeding up tariff eliminations with Korea and Japan under our existing agreements. There's things we can do unilaterally to improve our own competitiveness. I think I just kind of conclude the initial statements by just reframing the question, I think, as everyone else has done. The question is really whether is Canada prepared to look at the entire landscape of trade and regulatory issues. And I saw Rory threw out foreign policy as well. I think that's all got to be part of this whole thing of how we look at everything that we do in the world, and do it from a different lens. What are the things that are diminishing our current potential? And let's try to do things differently. So I hope our leaders are going to look at the present circumstance as an opportunity to look at where our own actions are holding us back and see what we can do differently.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. And we will go to our last panelist, and David will turn the floor over to you. David Plunkett was Ambassador of Canada to the European Union from 2011 to 2015. He's had a distinguished career in diplomacy and international trade, including as a trade policy officer, counselor, Director General, ADM, and Chief Trade Negotiator. He currently serves as the chairman of the Canada-EU Trade and Investment Association. So David, I'd appreciate your answer to whether or not Canada can hold its own, but I suppose feel free to take the same opportunity as everyone else and answer a different question as well, as if you'd like to. Over to you.
No, I can definitely say yes to the question. And one of the benefits of being the fourth speaker is I can also agree with points of the previous speakers. And I think as I was trying to come at this, my comments play nicely off of what John has just said, because I definitely think we can hold our own, especially if our government negotiators end up with a mandate that is both solid and flexible, and one which may need to include aspects outside of the areas we've traditionally done in the past. By way of context, I arrived back in Ottawa in 2006 from London and went into the trade policy branch in what is now Global Affairs. And it was a branch that had not yet concluded anything substantive for a number of years for a variety of reasons. But a change of approach allowed us to complete the EFTA and then undertake afterwards a whole series of initiatives, be it the CETA, the CPTPP, agreements with Latin America, air agreements, FIPAs, etc. And so there was a real push on diversification that I think Claire referred to and others. In 2006, we had young, often inexperienced staff, and yet looking at it today, we have plenty of extremely experienced and capable people in the system that can deal with the whole exercise from start to finish. And so I think the skill sets are there, certainly amongst the negotiators. And over the years, we've built in a very solid consultative network with business, provinces, the territories, and other stakeholders. Picking up sort of a point that John was making, limits on some of our past agreements were often due to the nature of the mandate that the negotiators were given, and things that we had to either exclude or minimize. And I think people will know most of the important ones. Canadian business is largely structured to take advantage of this huge US market, which has its own rules and regulations. And it makes perfect sense that business would take every opportunity that is available. But it's also true that protecting our access to the US market has inevitably limited our potential gains elsewhere. Canadian negotiators had to find creative ways to meet the legitimate demands of our prospective new trading partners without harming our existing deals with the US. It was not easy, and especially in areas like agriculture and autos, because of the integrated supply chains and structures which are well known. But as all three previous speakers have noted, the world is now changing quickly, largely due to President Trump. And I think it's important that we can no longer assume that we will have the same access to the US market, given his calls for US reshoring, economic nationalism, and the like. I agree with John, it's all speculative at this point, but I think we would be very remiss to take an approach of that could be a form of business as usual. I'm fully confident that every effort should and will be made to achieve some stability to our economic relationships with the US. And as I said, I think we have some very solid people involved that will be able to help us to that end. But given this changing global landscape, both at the economic and political level, I think picking up initially Claire's point, we need to optimize our relationships with other partners as well as reducing the interprovincial barriers to trade. But I think we also have to accept that past approaches to negotiations may well need to change. The CETA is an excellent starting point for Europe. Canada and the EU should launch a new economic study to identify where new opportunities exist and the shortcomings of the original agreement. As was pointed out, utilization is much lower than it can and should be, and I think we should be doing everything to change that. Initiatives outside of Europe obviously are also important, and I would never minimize the importance of these minor agreements, because while it may not make a huge dent for the economy as a whole, for particular industries or sectors or companies, it may be very important to their bottom lines. How we define, I noticed in the poll the number of people that said that could we hold our own? Yes, but not with the US. I think part of that is how you define how you define success. I think the CUSMA as it currently stands is a good example of that. That we were under an enormous amount of pressure under the first administration to make some serious changes, and I think we came out of that as a country in a quite a decent state. So if limiting damage can be considered a success, I think we shouldn't expect we're going to get everything, and we may face some real problems. But I think we will deal with it as best as anyone can. Picking up Colin's last points, just to finalize, I agree we remain an attractive market and a supplier of key products, including agriculture. And I think if we play this right, Canada can certainly hold its own in any of these trade agreements, including whatever is going to happen with Mr. Trump and others. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. And we're going to bring the other panelists in for the discussion. And we've got some good questions in the chat. Please feel free to go and put your questions in, and also use the opportunity to vote for other questions if you think that they are questions that the panel should get to. But David, I want to go back to you first. You said something at the end that I think other panelists have touched on as well around, it depends on how you define success. So David, in your mind, how do you define success in the outcome of a trade agreement?
Well, leaving aside the obvious, it can be in the eyes of the beholder. But you've got a president right now that's out there publicly stating, we don't need Canadian cars, we don't need Canadian lumber, and pick your poison. And making strong pitches, verbally at least, for reshoring and a fairly significant reshaping. In fact, you could see it as a ripping up of the international structures, whether it's the WTO, which is apparently having a serious discussion about what does this mean for the multilateral rules. If he is in effect ripping up bilateral agreements, I think success may be just minimizing the potential damage that is being done here. That said, I think we certainly as a country and others may be limited in how much we will influence this ourselves, except to the extent that the American consumers, American businesses who start to see the real impact of an extreme policy on their own economy, on their own lifestyles, they vote. We don't. And so I think some of this consultation process that Colin and others referred to is extremely important to try to contain this as much as possible. But I think I think we just basically need to accept that the good times that we've had with the U.S. market, may be under, coming under some significant pressure, and whether it's diversification, removing internal barriers to trade, improving utilization existing, you can come at success can take many shapes and forms. But I agree with everyone. It's going to be a rough road for a while, and if we can come out the other end in a reasonable shape, stronger as an economy, stronger as a country, maybe that's the success that we will end up with.
Now, John, when you're sitting there advocating on behalf of the beef industry in Canada, do you measure success in the amount of beef that gets exported from Canada to whatever country we're negotiating with, or is there a different way to think about it?
Well, I think ultimately the metric is profitability. It's not just about volumes or tons of beef, that sort of. It's are you, in the beef sector, we're different in that we're a disassembly operation to some extent. You know, we're producing an animal, and then that animal, you know, gets disassembled into several hundred different products, each of which you want to sell to the customer that's willing to pay the most for it. Sometimes that's in the United States, sometimes it's other markets. In terms of shipping live cattle, we're set up for Northwest trade, North-South trade. And it really doesn't make sense to sell live animals to any other country than the United States. And we need that access because we don't have enough capacity in Canada to process all of the animals we produce. Now, that's a Canada problem, right? You know, so we don't go to the States and talk about that. On the other hand, in the States, what you want to talk about is the fact that they need those animals down there. They don't have enough animals to run through their facilities. If they don't have that access to live animals coming from Canada, there's probably at least one, maybe two or three packing plants in the United States that will not continue to be viable. You know, so it's about talking to Americans and everybody who's participating this or isn't participating, anyone that sells an input or material into the United States, that is supporting some American job. And we need to get those American importers and creators of jobs from our materials to be talking to their elected leaders, whether that's governors, you know, cabinet ministers, if they've got access to the White House. Those are the conversations that have to happen. And you can kind of see in some sectors it's starting, but it's not nearly broad enough just yet.
And so, Claire, one of the questions that's come in speaks about kind of some of the challenges that John just talked about around logistics costs, and kind of the limitations and the realities of being able to move products around the world. I mean, we talk a lot about trade diversification. You talked about it in your remarks, but we also face a reality that we have supply chain restraints, we have added costs, and so how do we think about that? If we really want businesses to take advantage of these opportunities that are there, how should we be thinking about and what can be done around the realities of logistics and trade infrastructure?
Infrastructure and ability to get products to markets faster and more efficiently. And if we look at our competitors, others are doing it. So if it's technically possible for others, perhaps we can look at ways of doing it ourselves in a way that makes commercial sense. Some of our free trade agreements may not be fully utilized right now because, in part, because of some of these costs, and the commercial benefits are greater elsewhere, which is why, in part, the industry is looking at some of these other markets. But I think ultimately, echoing the points made earlier and that John just made, an opportunity to compete, and I would add a great benefit of free trade agreements, which businesses rely on, is the stability, the certainty, the ability to make decisions and figure what their costs are today, in 30 days and 60 days and so forth as well.
Now, Claire, just one of the, I'm going to use different words than everyone else used earlier, but one of the messages I think that kind of ran through several of the remarks was basically government's doing its job getting trade market access into other countries, but industry isn't, because industry is not taking advantage of those. Do you just want to kind of speak to the reality of some of the reasons why we don't see businesses stepping up to the plate and taking advantage of the market access that they have?
I think it was mentioned earlier, the U.S. has absorbed the majority of our exports, and it may well continue to be the case. But I think there is a bit of a wake-up call now in recognizing that we don't want to put all our eggs in the same basket. We have started to diversify. This is not new, but we need to to do a better job of it. But because of the proximity of the US and the integration of our supply chains across North America, we have relied a lot on that particular market, and perhaps not enough elsewhere.
And so Colin, again, it was noted, somebody picked up on this. We've got this question about whether or not we should be thinking about this as a trade issue, or whether or not this is about a broader foreign policy agenda and kind of a dangerous new world. And so if we were talking about, can Canada hold its own in that dangerous new world, would you answer any differently than you answered the question about whether or not Canada can hold its own in trade negotiations?
We can hold our own, but we've run down the key elements of being able to hold our own. And that's, first of all, our diplomatic service, which really hasn't grown much for 15, 20 years. And we do stuff on the cheap. And I think that's got to shift. We've also got to encourage the diplomats, give them the tools to do the job. The defense establishment has certainly been run down, and the Americans are pointing this out, and our allies are pointing this out. We're going to have to probably spend closer to 5%. You know, the insurance premiums have gone up because geopolitics have changed, and weight in the world now is attributed in part to what can you bring to the table in terms of military strength. And we don't do it just because we want to have an expeditionary force. We want to do it because we have to defend our north, which most Canadians agree to. So that's going to be a big seismic change. And then there's development assistance, which I think we will rethink, but we've also run that way down. We don't really play there. And yet with climate change and global warming and migration, this is a role that Canada has played in the past as the kind of helpful fixer, the bridge, the linchpin, and that's what also gives us our weight in Washington. Washington's always vitally interested in what Canadians are thinking of, because they think we come closest to them in terms of assessing the world. And the rest of the world also sees us, when we have that capacity in defense and diplomacy and aid, to be interpreters of what's going on in Washington, especially when you got a rogue elephant in charge as you do today. And so they come to us and say, explain this. Never forget, when Mr. Trudeau had been a year before Mr. Trump first came to power. In the first year, he spent his efforts trying to reach out to the world, going to the various summits and things. And then on that November day in 2016, when Mr. Trump won, the phone calls were all coming the other way. Explain to us what just happened in Washington. And that's a role that Canada can play. So I don't discount our ability to play a useful, helpful fixer role, but we are going to have to invest in that. And that will also be necessary, as you point out, Tyler, because the geopolitics have changed.
And so, David, one of the things that hasn't changed is that we all have sensitive interests in the world, and maybe the way that the negotiations unfold is a little bit different today. But sensitivities, where domestic sensitivities was brought up in one of the answers. We've got a question about how Canada's quotas on supply managed products kind of impact the dynamic and play out. But I think, again, it's worth going back to, we all have sensitivities at the end of the day. Can you kind of speak to how you see the impact that our own domestic sensitivities have had in negotiations, and how they relate compared to the sensitivities you would have seen on the European side, for example, when you were setting?
Yeah, sure. Well, supply management is an obvious example. And just to be sort of stark to make the point, if we the negotiators, and again picking up John's point, the negotiators are reflecting the mandate that they have been given by the government in question. They're not out there picking this up out of the air. This is what they are told based on the politics of the governing party. But if the negotiators show up at the negotiating table and tell their partner across the table, you know, for example, New Zealand or whoever, England or UK in this case, supply management is completely off the table. And we know, because part of the preparations that go into any negotiation are understanding what the opponent's strengths and weaknesses, where are their offensive issues, where are their defensive. If we know that one of their major offensive objectives is to improve their access to our market in the supply managed area. And we announced in day one that, and by the way, this area is completely closed. It's not going to come as any surprise to that they're going to say, well, your access then for beef or widgets or whatever is also going to be extremely limited, because if you don't give us what we want, we're certainly not going to just hand you everything you want. That's just it's just common sense.
Right.
And so it is perfectly understandable that the more you take off the tables, particularly in advance, you are limiting what your potential gains are. You combine that with, and I use the EU because it's one I'm close to. The EU is a huge power, market, 400 or 500 million people, etc. They've got all sorts of rules and regulations that John and Claire and others have had to deal with over the years. And they're not always consistent with our traditional NAFTA or rules with the US. If we want to get into their market, a market of, which is bigger in terms of population than the US, it only stands to reason that we're going to have to deal with their standard and rules and regulations in the same way that people exporting to Canada have to deal with some of our rules and regulations, which may not be the same as theirs. And so, if we're not prepared to make the efforts for whatever reason, and it could be cost, you don't want to run two lines of business, et cetera, these can have limitations, which is, I guess, back to my own point. Part of this has been driven by the fact that we've had this huge prosperous market to our south. If that suddenly starts to wither a bit, steps that we were not prepared to take in the past, we may have to revisit and say, well, maybe it now makes sense. And just picking up on the, this point about, that you made to Colin, I would agree with everything he said. And I guess 2 points. One is, if you look at this past week, the tremors that have gone through Europe when Vance and others made their statements about international security and whatnot. The Europeans have had 2 or 3 meetings already as they're trying to figure out what to do in all this. And so everybody's trying to figure out at various levels, various perspectives, where to come at this. And so we're not alone in this. We're not the only ones trying to figure out how to deal with the elephant or gorilla or whatever you call it. Everybody's facing the same situation. And I agreed. I think there'll be a lot of communication back and forth of what do you think? How are you coming at this? And so a collective wisdom trying to work our way through this difficult period ahead is probably inevitable.
And it's worth noting
we should take advantage of that opportunity as well. It's a huge challenge, but it is also an opportunity that if the world is changing, if Washington is going to, they've started with us, they're starting to pick on others. They're going to isolate themselves. So I think the rest of us outside of the United States need to get aligned on what can we do with each other, because we need to help each other. We might need more assistance from Europe. They might need more from us. But let's make the trade and economics work as well.
And so I want to kind of end on a different note about opportunity, because one of the questions that's come up is around that domestic market. And I think everybody has kind of touched on variations of that as part of a trade agenda. How should we be thinking about the opportunity domestically versus the need to diversify into markets abroad, and how does kind of a different approach to thinking domestically in Canada better position us to hold our own in trade agreements? Would someone like to take that one first? John, do you want to get in on that?
Yeah, well, I think we all do need to look at where are we shooting ourselves in the foot, because I keep coming back to the cattle and the beef side. It's what I know the best, and I know that we're set up more to trade north-south than we are to trade east-west. And we are getting farther away from being able to trade east-west. We've got some regulatory issues in terms of the expenses that it takes to process animals into meat. It's cheaper to do it in the United States. And so, we tend to end up sending animals that we should be processing here, that if we had a better regulatory operating environment, we would have more investment to be able to have the capacity to process those animals. We've been making it more and more difficult to move cattle from the west to the east, and it just makes more sense to ship them the longer distances, to send them south, or to bring them from the southeast US states into the eastern Canadian market than to bring them from Alberta and Saskatchewan. So those are some things that we need to look at. And now maybe we'll be forced to look at them if we have to be more self-sufficient. There are definitely things that we can do to improve our own competitiveness.
Tyler, I'd invite listeners to look at a Globe and Mail cartoon last week that had walls around the 13 provinces and territories, making the point that we still have a tremendous amount of work to do within Canada, and that's where I think it has to start. As Mr. Reagan said, tear down those walls. I think the next prime minister should say, tear down the walls. The premiers and the prime minister have a responsibility here. We can do it, and we would certainly become a more competitive, and that would put us on the road, I think, because I think we can compete. And I remember we were going around to tool and die shops before we did the original Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. We later fought an election on. They were all worried. Could we compete? Well, we did. Now we've got big companies like Martin Ray and Linamar and Magna. The same applies to how we've restructured agriculture. You look at lentils and pulse now, where it used to be wheat and barley. We can compete, but we sometimes need a bit of a kick. And supply management, I'd be the first to say, let that go. I look at our dairy industry. It's a wonderful communications effort in Canada. And I think that we can be as good as the Australians and New Zealanders who went through the same kind of experience. I used to serve Quebec cheeses at receptions in Los Angeles and Washington, and people said, where can I get this stuff? Well, you can't. Well, you can now, and we've proven, again, with Saputo and things, that we can compete. The problem is not so much exterior as internal, and just our own feeling of inferiority and inadequacy, which has no good basis in fact, because we actually are strong and can compete.
So before we go back to a concluding statement with everyone, we're going to put the poll up and ask and see whether or not anyone's changed their minds. But Colin, I do want to kind of pick up that note on supply management, because it is a lively topic today, just to kind of highlight that. I think part of the other reality is that the concessions today probably aren't worth very much. And we see this kind of suggestion that maybe we should, throw the system under the proverbial bus in order to curry favor with the United States. And I guess I'm not convinced that that's going to get us very far at the end of the day. I don't know if you're going to want to respond to that or not.
Well, I don't think we do that, but it is a bargaining chip. And I think that if the agreement comes down, the Americans say, we want better access to dairy, as opposed to having no agreement or not, I think that we will bend. But I do think that'll be one of the first things that we will, as David said, putting it on the table and saying you can't have it, you pay for it as a consequence. And are we ready to continue to pay for this? I don't think we can or will, but there will have to be compensation, and we are skilled at that as well.
So, and it is worth noting, I think that it's an unfortunate when our trade minister today says that we won't make any concessions, because that's just not the reality. So It seems like the number of people that think that Canada can hold its own has gone up during the discussion today. So I think that that's probably a good sign. We've convinced them that we're there, but we'll give everyone an opportunity just to briefly wrap up with any concluding remarks. We'll go around the room in the opposite function. David, a minute to you to kind of wrap up.
Well, I'll be very short, and it sort of picks up that last bit of the discussion. I think it was Churchill that made the line that we shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. And I think whether that's attacking interprovincial barriers to trade, improving our diversification, utilization, whatever you want to come at it, however you want to call it, we don't necessarily need to come out of this crisis as a shattered country, we could come out of this actually stronger and more able to deal with the challenges of the future if we play it right.
Yeah, thank you. John, to you for a concluding remark.
Yeah, no, I would just say I feel energized about the opportunities coming up. You know, I think it's going to be ugly. I think we're going to have a lot of difficulties that we have to work through. You know, those of us who are retired and living on our investments are worried. But I think we come out of the end of this with something stronger, and we just have to be bold and be open to new ideas and have leadership that gets us there.
Great. Thank you. Colin, to you.
Sure. I think, you know, to be born here or to come to this country, you win the lottery. We've got everything in this country, resources, we've got diversity, people. We really do. We should be proud. What Canada does extremely well when we put our mind to it. I think once again, we've got to put our mind to it because the world has changed, but there is opportunities, as David pointed out and John points out and Claire pointed out, for us to do well because we've got everything it takes to be a very successful nation.
Great. And Claire, final concluding remark to you.
Can we hold our own trade agreements? I think for me, the short answer is yes, but with caveats and the strong need for internal adjustments, leveraging the power of industry and government relationships. I will say for the short term, let's continue to focus as well on the US and the CUSMA review or renegotiation, what it will take. But let's be completely clear as to the strong winds that are coming and the need to look at the globe in its entirety.
Great. Thank you, Claire. And so thank you to Claire, David, Colin, and John for taking part today. I think that there was this sense of optimism. Again, we put out our risk report that was optimism and realism. And so maybe my note of realism at the end is that what I heard is that you're optimistic if we do the hard work and the hard things that we need to do. And so that is often the part I think that we need to remind ourselves that we can get through this, but we need to double down, put our put our shoulders into this so that we can get through it at the end of the day. And that's part of what we will continue to do at CAPI is our role to try and offer new thinking, new ideas to help us get us through these solutions. We'll do that in part at our next webinar, which is next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern, where we will dive into the question about risk and whether or not Canada's got the right systems ahead to manage that. You can see all of our webinars on our CAPI YouTube channel. Follow us on social media. Subscribe to our newsletters to hear more and stay in touch with all of the great things we've got going on. Thank you to our panelists and to our spectators. Have a great day.